James had always believed that money was the answer to everything. From a young age, he had watched his parents use their wealth to navigate the world, purchasing the finest things and gaining the admiration of those around them with their sheer presence. He had inherited this belief in the power of wealth, and as he grew older, it became clear that his own fortune made through a series of savvy investments and entrepreneurial ventures only magnified his confidence in that ideology. For James, money was not just a tool, it was a shield, a constant companion that allowed him to move through life without a second thought. He could buy the most luxurious cars, live in the most exclusive penthouses, and take the most lavish vacations. Everything was within his grasp, and it always had been. People looked up to him, envied him, and treated him with the reverence that only wealth could command. To him, this was evidence that money solved everything. If you had enough of it, there was no problem you couldn't overcome, no obstacle you couldn't remove from your path. But there was something James had never truly understood, something money could never buy: the value of real, genuine connections. Despite his success, despite his abundance, James was often alone. His relationships were shallow, built on the exchange of favors, the thrill of mutual benefit, or the desire for personal gain. Friends and business partners came and went, each one carefully selected for their ability to enhance his life in some way. He had never known what it meant to have someone who cared about him for who he was, not for what he could offer. He had never experienced the depth of a relationship where trust, vulnerability, and emotional intimacy were the foundation. Instead, he surrounded himself with people who fed into his ego, who praised his achievements, but never questioned his way of life or the emptiness beneath the surface. He believed in his own superiority, convinced that anyone who doubted his worldview was simply misguided, unable to see the advantages of wealth as clearly as he did. James never thought to ask himself why his relationships felt so hollow, or why, despite his success, he still felt a quiet loneliness in his chest. He didn't need to. He had his money, and to him, that was enough. But life, as it often does, had a way of humbling those who were too sure of themselves, and James was about to learn this lesson in the most unexpected way. It began one night at a gala, a high-profile event thrown by one of his many business contacts. As usual, he moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging pleasantries, shaking hands, and accepting compliments with the kind of self-assurance that came from years of being adored for his wealth. But as the evening wore on, he found himself slipping into a quieter part of the venue, feeling oddly disconnected from the revelry around him. For the first time in a long while, he became aware of the emptiness that clung to him. People smiled at him, yes, but did they really see him? Did they care about who he was, beyond the designer suits and the glint of his watch? Did anyone genuinely want to know him as a person, or were they all just after what he could give them? That night, he found himself sitting alone at a corner table, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses a distant murmur. As he glanced around, he saw a group of his so-called friends laughing animatedly with someone else, their conversation light and carefree. But when they turned to look at him, the smiles faltered, and the briefest flicker of discomfort crossed their faces before they moved on. It was subtle, but it was there. James had never felt so invisible. It wasn't until later that evening, after the gala had wound down, that his feelings of isolation grew sharper. He returned to his penthouse, the lavish space cold and impersonal, and poured himself a drink as he gazed out over the city skyline. He thought about all the people he had known, all the friends he had made in his rise to the top, and yet, there was no one he could truly call a friend. There was no one who knew the real James, the one who struggled with self-doubt, the one who feared that all he had built was just a mask, an illusion. His mind began to wander, and he realized just how much he had missed, how much he had been too blind to see. The shallow praise, the handshakes, the admiration, it had all been empty, and he had built his entire life around it. But none of it had brought him the one thing he needed most, a true connection, someone who would stand by him when the accolades stopped and the money no longer mattered. That realization hit him harder than any business setback ever had. He had spent so much time focused on acquiring wealth, on building an empire, that he had neglected the very thing that could bring him true fulfillment. As he sat in his penthouse, the lights of the city twinkling below him, James finally understood that wealth, for all its power, could never buy the things that mattered most: love, friendship, genuine connection. In that moment of clarity, he felt a profound sadness, not for the money he had accumulated, but for the years he had spent believing it was enough. He didn't know where to start, how to change, or if it was even possible to rebuild his life into something more meaningful. But for the first time in his life, he understood the depth of his own loneliness, and that, perhaps, was the first step toward truly living. James had always been accustomed to the attention that came with his wealth. The power of his name, the allure of his bank account, the luxury of his lifestyle, these things had always seemed to draw people toward him like moths to a flame. But as he entered the sleek glass building that housed his office, something felt different this day. Among the usual stream of busy workers and eager colleagues who sought his approval or plotted ways to secure a piece of his fortune, there was one person who caught his eye: Ava. She wasn't the type to fawn over him or speak with the kind of deference he had grown used to. Instead, she moved with a quiet confidence, her composure unshaken, as if the world around her was a mere blur. She was the receptionist, a position he had never paid much attention to, but today, as he walked past her desk, he noticed the way she seemed to ignore his presence, as if he were just another person walking by. This intrigued him, more than he would admit. After all, for years, James had been the object of admiration, envy, and awe in every room he entered. Yet, Ava's indifference didn't come across as rude or dismissive. There was no arrogance in her stance, no hidden motive. She was simply unaffected. James, with his usual flair, decided to engage. He straightened his posture, flashed a confident smile, and made a show of casually leaning against the desk. "I don't think we've met before," he said smoothly, his voice carrying a hint of playful charm. "I'm James. You must be new around here." Ava glanced up from her computer screen, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Ava," she replied simply, her voice calm and steady. There was no sparkle in her eyes, no admiration in her tone. Just a quiet acknowledgement, as though his name meant little to her in the grand scheme of things. The lack of any visible recognition or enthusiasm from her struck James harder than he expected. Usually, when people met him, their eyes would widen, their posture would shift, or they would find some way to compliment him, often subtly, sometimes not so subtly. But not Ava. She didn't look impressed, didn't bat an eyelash at his presence. "So, what's it like working in a place like this?" he pressed, trying again, his curiosity piqued. This time, Ava didn't rush to answer, as though weighing his question with an air of detached consideration. "It's fine," she said, offering a simple but honest response. She looked at him for a moment longer, as if assessing the man standing before her, before adding, "The work isn't the issue. It's the people." James raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her words. "Oh," he asked, leaning in slightly, the shift in his demeanor telling Ava that he was more interested than he had been a moment ago. "What about the people?" Ava met his gaze without flinching, her expression composed but thoughtful. They come and go. Some look for validation, others for opportunity. I don't expect anything from them, and they don't expect anything from me. Her words were honest and free from any pretense, and in that moment, something in James stirred. He had heard those words from employees, from clients, even from friends, but there was an edge to Ava's delivery, something that set her apart. The air around her was quiet but strong, unruffled by the material world that had built his empire. And for the first time in a long while, James found himself feeling insignificant. He chuckled, though it wasn't a typical laugh of amusement, it was something more self-aware, almost humbling. I suppose that's one way to look at it, he said, his voice softer now. Most people would kill for a chance to be in my position. Ava didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced back at her screen, then back to him, her gaze unwavering. I've never been interested in positions, or wealth, or status, she said, her voice still calm, but now with a certain finality. I've always been more interested in people, in who they really are when you strip everything else away. There was something in her words, something that dug deeper into James than he cared to admit. He had spent so much of his life defining himself by his wealth, by the people who needed him or admired him for what he had, rather than for who he was. But Ava didn't care about any of that. She wasn't impressed by the suit he wore, the car he drove, or the name he had built for himself in the business world. She saw him, quite simply, as just another person. And that honesty, that simplicity, felt like a mirror reflecting parts of himself he had long since hidden from view. For a moment, a quiet tension lingered in the space between them, neither uncomfortable nor forced, but filled with an unspoken truth. James wanted to impress her, wanted her to acknowledge him in the way others did. But Ava wasn't swayed by any of it. She wasn't interested in his power or his wealth. She was only interested in who he really was beneath it all. After a long pause, James straightened up, pulling himself out of the moment. Well, Ava, he said, his voice taking on a more familiar tone, I have to say, you're unlike anyone I've met. She smiled then, a small, knowing smile that didn't ask for anything, and nodded. That's usually the case, she said simply. James, for the first time, realized he had been the one who had tried to impress, and in that realization, he found himself unexpectedly drawn to Ava's genuine, calm demeanor. She didn't need anything from him, and perhaps that was exactly what made her so intriguing. As he walked away, he felt a subtle shift within himself, as though Ava had unknowingly peeled back the layers he had built around himself over the years. She had shown him that there was more to life than wealth, more to a person than the outward trappings of success. And as much as he didn't want to admit it, he found himself hoping that one day, he might find the courage to be seen in the same way without the gold, without the title, just as James. James had always prided himself on control over his career, his wealth, his social circle, and most certainly over his relationships. Money, he'd learned early on, was the key to everything. It was power, it was attraction, and it was a way to navigate through the world on his terms. Women, in particular, were drawn to his success, his polished exterior, and the lifestyle that came with it. He had never had to try very hard to impress anyone, his wealth and status did the work for him. Yet, when he met Ava, everything he believed about relationships and attraction was quietly turned on its head. She was unlike anyone he had ever known. Ava was quiet, humble almost to a fault, with none of the flashy charm or material desires that he was used to. She didn't look at him with the same wide-eyed admiration that most people did, nor did she fawn over his achievements. In fact, she seemed almost indifferent to them. At first, James was intrigued. He'd never encountered someone who wasn't at least a little impressed by his success, and the more he tried to show her what he had to offer, the more she seemed to retreat into herself, her gaze often shifting away when he mentioned his wealth or the luxuries that surrounded him. "You really don't have to do that," she would say softly, when he offered to buy her extravagant gifts or take her out to expensive dinners. "I'm happy with simple things." It baffled him, this calm disinterest. Most women would have been thrilled by the prospect of a life filled with luxury, a life he could easily provide. But Ava wasn't swayed by any of it. She didn't seem to need him the way other people did. She didn't need his money to validate her worth. It was as though she saw through the exterior he had so carefully crafted and instead, saw him just him, without the trappings of wealth or status. And that scared him. Ava had a quiet strength about her that he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't the kind of strength that was loud or imposing, but rather one that was serene, unshakable, and entirely unaffected by the world's opinions or expectations. There was something in the way she moved through life, grounded, unpretentious, unhurried, that intrigued him. She didn't flinch when he spoke about his business or his latest achievement. She didn't lean in for a better seat at the table, nor did she try to impress him with her own accomplishments or background. She simply existed, fully, without the need for validation. It was something James had never encountered before, and it unsettled him in ways he wasn't accustomed to. His wealth, his confidence, the influence he wielded, none of it seemed to matter to her. For the first time in his life, James felt himself out of control. He was used to being the one to dictate the terms of his relationships, the one to lead and guide. But with Ava, he was at a loss. Her indifference to the things he had always used to assert dominance forced him to face a truth he had never considered before: his money couldn't buy genuine connection. The realization was jarring, but it was also liberating. In Ava's presence, he had to be real. He had to let go of the polished version of himself he had so carefully curated. She wasn't impressed by his suits, his private jets, or the exclusive circles he moved in. She didn't care about his bank balance or his ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. What she cared about was the small moments: the way he listened when she spoke, the way he held the door for her without thinking, the kindness that lay beneath the veneer of his success. And what he found was that in these moments, he was starting to see himself differently. Ava's simplicity had a way of drawing out a version of James he had long buried under layers of ambition and expectation. He started to realize that perhaps there was more to life than just winning, than just accumulating wealth and status. Maybe, just maybe, there was something more fulfilling about the quiet strength she carried, about the simplicity of her needs and desires, which were rooted in authenticity, not materialism. But it wasn't just Ava's indifference to his money that challenged him, it was her presence itself. She didn't need to impress anyone because she was already enough. And that was what James found so incredibly intriguing. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one who held the power in a relationship. He wasn't the one who decided when to call, when to make the next move, when to offer the next grand gesture. Ava wasn't playing by his rules, and that both humbled and fascinated him. She didn't need him to solve her problems or sweep her off her feet with grand gestures. She didn't even need him to rescue her. Instead, she offered him something far more rare, an invitation to show up as his true self. No masks, no games, no expectations. And in that invitation, James found something he hadn't even realized he was searching for: freedom. For the first time, he could just be himself, without the pressure of living up to the image he had spent so long creating. Ava had unknowingly stripped away the need for control, revealing to him a new kind of connection, a deeper, more vulnerable one. As time went on, James began to let go of the need to win, to be in control, to always have the upper hand. With Ava, he learned that relationships were not about power, not about proving one's worth, but about sharing a quiet space together, free from expectation, free from pretense. Ava's simplicity, her quiet strength, had taught him that the most profound connections weren't built on what you had to offer, but on who you were willing to become when you allowed someone else to simply be. James had spent most of his life surrounded by people who only saw him for his wealth, his power, and his status. He had been groomed from a young age to believe that these things were what made him valuable, that they were the currency with which he could buy respect, admiration, and love. But there was something about Ava that made him question everything he had ever known. From the moment he met her, there was an unshakable calm about her, an ease in her presence that had no regard for his name or fortune. She didn't fawn over him, didn't indulge in the subtle compliments that others might shower on him, nor did she seem impressed by his success. It intrigued him. It bothered him. And as the days passed, James found himself seeking out more of her company, trying to figure out what it was about her that made her so unaffected by him. Every conversation with her was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. It wasn't that she was indifferent or cold, quite the opposite. She was warm, kind, and genuinely curious about him, but there was a simplicity in her that made him feel, for the first time in his life, like he was just another person. No special treatment, no flattering gestures. She seemed to appreciate him not for his wealth or his influence, but simply for who he was, and that was something James had never experienced before. One afternoon, as they sat in a small cafe, sipping coffee and watching the world bustle around them, James finally asked her, with a slight edge of vulnerability in his voice, "Ava, why do you never ask me about my business, my life, or any of the things people usually want to know?" Ava looked at him, her eyes thoughtful, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I don't need to know about all that to see who you really are, James," she said quietly, her words simple yet profound. "People get caught up in the noise, the money, the status, the expectations, but I've always believed that what really matters is what's underneath all of that. And with you, I can see there's more to you than just what the world shows." Her words struck him in a way he couldn't explain, something stirring deep within him, something he hadn't realized he was missing. For years, James had surrounded himself with people who wanted something from him: attention, approval, validation. He had built his empire with the belief that he was valuable because of what he could offer, what he could give, and what he could do. But Ava didn't need any of that. She didn't want his money, his influence, or his extravagant gifts. What she seemed to crave was something far simpler: connection. The realization hit him like a wave. Ava's simplicity wasn't a flaw, it was her strength. She didn't seek validation through possessions or achievements. She was content in herself, in her own company, in the quiet moments that others often overlooked. And that was what made her extraordinary. Her ease with who she was, her ability to remain grounded amidst a world that constantly demanded more, was a kind of freedom he had never known. As they continued to talk, the layers of his own life began to peel away, bit by bit. He had been living in a bubble, one where every interaction was tainted by expectations and obligations, where people only cared about what he could do for them, not who he was beneath the surface. But with Ava, he felt none of that pressure. He felt no need to impress, no urge to show off his accomplishments. With her, he could just be. She listened to him, not as the CEO, not as the man with the big house and expensive cars, but as James, the person who had fears, doubts, and a lifetime of experiences he had never shared with anyone. There was something remarkably humbling about her. James began to realize that he had been living his life backward. He had spent so much time chasing success, thinking it would bring him happiness, that he had forgotten the simple joys of human connection. He had built an empire, but in the process, he had lost touch with the very things that made life meaningful: honesty, vulnerability, and authenticity. Ava didn't care about his empire. She cared about the way he treated people, the way he showed up for others, the way he saw the world. She was a reminder that happiness didn't come from achievements or accolades, it came from being true to oneself, from the quiet moments of understanding that didn't require anything more than being present. The more time James spent with Ava, the more he found himself shedding the layers of his old identity. He stopped feeling the need to justify his success, to boast about his accomplishments, or to hide behind the facade of the powerful businessman he had once been. Instead, he allowed himself to be vulnerable with her, to share his doubts and his fears, and in doing so, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Ava's impact on him was subtle, but it was profound. She didn't ask him to change, didn't try to mold him into someone else. She simply existed as she was, whole, authentic, and unpretentious. And in that simplicity, she became everything he had unknowingly been searching for. For the first time in his life, James realized that he didn't need to chase approval or success to feel complete. Ava had shown him that the greatest gift was simply being seen and accepted for who he truly was. And in her quiet, unassuming way, she had given him a new understanding of what it meant to be free. James had always prided himself on his ability to win people over, whether it was in business meetings, social circles, or even romantic pursuits. His wealth, carefully cultivated over the years, had been his most powerful tool, a gleaming symbol of success and confidence that made others take notice, made them respect him, or at the very least, admire him from a distance. But recently, something had shifted inside him, something he couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried to push it aside. Ava was different. She was the one person who seemed completely indifferent to his wealth, to the polished image he had so carefully constructed over the years. She didn't look at him with the same awe that others did when he walked into a room. She didn't bat an eyelash when he casually mentioned his latest acquisition or the high-end brand he wore. Instead, she looked at him with a cool, assessing gaze, as if she saw beyond the money, beyond the surface, to something deeper. And that's what unnerved him. For the first time in his life, James felt vulnerable. His usual sense of self-assurance faltered, and it terrified him. He wasn't used to feeling this way: uncertain, unsure of himself, and worse, unable to figure out why he couldn't seem to win her over. With every attempt to impress her, whether through lavish dinners, extravagant gifts, or stories of his business triumphs, he found himself met with silence, indifference, or even a faint look of disappointment. It was as if she saw right through the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. Ava's lack of interest forced James to confront the one thing he had never fully acknowledged, the emptiness that lingered beneath the surface of his wealth. For years, he had believed that money could fill the void in his life, that it could buy him happiness, love, and respect. But with Ava, it was as if all his material success had no value. She didn't need his money, his status, or his connections. She didn't want his expensive gifts or his lavish gestures. She wanted something else, something that James couldn't quite put into words. For the first time, James felt like an imposter. He had spent so many years cultivating a persona of wealth and power that it had become his identity, his shield against the world. But Ava's indifference stripped away that shield, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and unsure of who he really was without the trappings of success. He had never questioned his worth before, never had to wonder if the relationships in his life were genuine or if people cared about him for reasons other than what he could provide. But with Ava, all of that was thrown into question. What was it about her that made him feel like this? What was it about her that made him feel small when he was used to being the one in control? These questions gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into a sense of self-doubt. He began to ask himself uncomfortable questions. Was his wealth the only thing that made people value him? Had he ever been truly loved for who he was, or just for what he could offer? Ava's indifference, though painful, forced him to look at the hollowness that lay beneath his success. It made him realize that he had built his entire life around the idea of success as defined by wealth and status, but it had never brought him the fulfillment he had always hoped for. He had used his wealth to shield himself from his insecurities, but now, in the face of Ava's cool detachment, he couldn't hide from them anymore. For the first time in his life, James felt exposed, unsure of himself, and completely vulnerable. His wealth, which had once been a symbol of power, now felt like a cage. He had lived his life believing that money could solve everything, that it could win people's affection, make up for his flaws, and give him a sense of security. But Ava showed him that there were things money couldn't buy. As he watched her from a distance, James realized that she valued honesty, integrity, and depth of character, things that he had long neglected in his pursuit of success. He saw the way she interacted with the world, the way she didn't flinch at his displays of wealth but also didn't seek to take advantage of them. She was grounded in a way that James had never been, and it both fascinated and terrified him. The more he thought about it, the more he understood, Ava wasn't indifferent to him as a person, but to the illusion he had built around himself. She didn't care about his money or his accomplishments. She cared about the man beneath it all, and that was a man James didn't know how to be. For the first time, James felt like he had to truly face himself, not as a successful businessman or a wealthy playboy, but as a person who had built his life around the false belief that material wealth could fill the emptiness inside. He began to wonder if it was time to let go of the persona he had carefully crafted. Maybe it was time to step into something more real, something that didn't rely on the validation of his wealth or the admiration of others. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to start seeking fulfillment in a way that didn't involve money at all. But that was a daunting thought. The road ahead was unclear, and James wasn't sure if he was ready to let go of the only thing that had ever given him a sense of control. As he faced the mirror of Ava's indifference, James realized that he had a choice: continue down the same path of superficial success, or take a chance on discovering who he really was, without the crutch of his wealth. The fear of the unknown was paralyzing, but for the first time in a long while, James felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could become someone who didn't need money to prove his worth, someone who could win over others with the strength of his character, not his bank account. But that would require him to face the most difficult challenge of all: looking inward and confronting the emptiness that had always lingered beneath the surface. James had always measured success by the number of zeros on a paycheck, the prestige of a job title, and the luxury of a life filled with expensive tastes and the latest gadgets. He'd climbed the corporate ladder with relentless focus, convinced that wealth and status were the keys to fulfillment. But even with everything he had: an impressive penthouse, designer suits, and all the things society told him he should want, something always felt missing. It wasn't until he met Ava that he began to question his entire worldview. She wasn't like the people in his circle, those who exchanged their time for money, trading genuine connection for fleeting pleasures. Ava's life was modest, uncomplicated, yet it seemed to hold a richness that James couldn't understand. They had met through a mutual friend, and their conversations had always been light casual chats about work, hobbies, and current events. But one evening, over a quiet dinner at a local cafe, the conversation shifted in a way James didn't expect. Ava, for the first time, opened up about her life, speaking with a softness in her voice that made James listen more intently. She told him about the simple joys she found in the world, the way the sunlight felt warm on her skin during morning walks, how she cherished small, unplanned moments with her friends, and the peace she found in her daily routine. "I don't need much," she said, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Just a few good people, good conversations, and time to enjoy the little things." James couldn't help but stare at her, his mind struggling to reconcile her words with everything he had known. She went on to explain how she didn't have the distractions of wealth, how she wasn't constantly worried about keeping up appearances or chasing after the next big promotion. Instead, Ava focused on the present moment, finding fulfillment in the connections she nurtured and the experiences she could share with others, whether it was cooking dinner for friends or hiking a new trail on the weekends. It wasn't about accumulating things, it was about living deeply, authentically, and without the constant pressure to measure up to an ideal. The more Ava spoke, the more her words sank into James's chest, stirring something within him. He had never considered a life like that, one where success wasn't defined by bank accounts and designer labels, but by the intangible things that created lasting joy. He found himself reflecting on his own life, the hours he spent hunched over a desk, buried in spreadsheets, consumed by work he didn't care about, only for the sake of proving something to himself and to others. "That sounds so freeing," he said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of vulnerability. Ava smiled softly, as though she had known all along the kind of shift her words would spark. "It is," she said. "But it's a choice, James. It's about choosing to live for what really matters, not for what society tells you should matter. There's a whole world outside of work and material things, and I don't want to miss it." Her words echoed in his mind long after their conversation ended. The weight of them lingered, leaving him unsettled and unsure. He had always believed that success was everything. His ambition had defined him for so long that he never thought to question it. But now, after hearing Ava talk about finding meaning in the simplest of moments, he realized how little he truly appreciated the world around him. He had been so caught up in building an empire that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly live, to savor the quiet, beautiful moments that made life rich in ways money could never replicate. Over the next few days, James found himself replaying that conversation over and over, his thoughts drifting to the choices he had made and the path he had been on. For the first time, he questioned the very priorities that had driven him for years. Was it worth it? Was all the striving, all the endless chasing, really what he wanted out of life? Or had he been so focused on an image of success that he had forgotten what it meant to be truly present? James began to notice the small, everyday things he had once overlooked: the sound of children laughing in the park, the way the sky changed colors at sunset, the genuine conversations with colleagues that went beyond just business. He started to let go of the rigid idea of success that had held him captive for so long, allowing himself to experience the world with a renewed sense of curiosity and openness. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but Ava's words had planted a seed within him that slowly began to grow. Over time, James made changes. He took more time for himself, spent less time chasing after promotions that no longer felt fulfilling, and began to nurture the relationships in his life, focusing on the connections that truly mattered. He learned to value experiences over possessions and to embrace the quiet joy of a life lived authentically. and through it all, he found himself drawn to Ava not just because she had opened his eyes to a new way of living, but because her genuine heart and quiet wisdom had shown him a path he never thought to walk before. As he stood on the edge of this new chapter in his life, James realized that success wasn't about what you had, it was about who you were, how you lived, and the moments you chose to embrace. Ava had given him the gift of seeing life through a different lens, and in doing so, she had forever changed him. James had always seen wealth as a symbol of success, a means to command respect, and a way to fill the empty spaces in his life that nothing else seemed to touch. For years, his money was his armor, a shield against vulnerability, a tool to gain admiration, and, for lack of a better term, a weapon he wielded to control the world around him. He used it to build his empire, to host extravagant parties, and to surround himself with people who seemed to appreciate his power, even if only for what it could give them. But over time, a quiet dissatisfaction began to creep in. It wasn't immediate, nor was it dramatic, but there were moments, small, fleeting instances that caused him to pause. It could be the look in a waiter's eyes when he left an oversized tip, the subtle discomfort of people laughing at his jokes because they feared offending him, or the hollow conversations that followed his latest acquisition. In the midst of his material success, James began to feel the weight of loneliness. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that came from being alone, but rather the kind that comes from never feeling truly seen, never feeling like his relationships were grounded in anything deeper than superficial admiration for his wealth. It was in this quiet emptiness that Ava entered his life, not as a colleague, not as someone who needed anything from him, but as a person who simply saw him. At first, he hadn't thought much of her, a talented executive, of course, but just another person in his vast network of employees. She was intelligent, hardworking, and focused, but what caught James' attention wasn't her competence or ambition, it was her ability to be grounded, to interact with him not as a wealthy CEO, but as a person, something he hadn't encountered in years. Ava didn't flatter him. She didn't hang on his every word or praise his latest business deal. Instead, she engaged with him as an equal, someone who was more concerned with making a meaningful impact than with climbing a corporate ladder or winning his approval. There was an authenticity about her that intrigued him, and as their professional relationship grew, so did his respect for her. Over time, their conversations shifted from purely business-related matters to deeper topics. They spoke about life, their personal dreams, the kind of legacy they wanted to leave behind, and the values that drove them. Slowly, without him realizing it, James began to see his wealth differently, not as something to be hoarded or flaunted, but as a tool for change, a resource that could be used for more than just his own enjoyment. He started to listen when Ava talked about social responsibility, sustainability, and the importance of using resources to uplift communities. He found himself genuinely moved by her belief that wealth should serve a higher purpose, that it should be a means to make the world a better place, not just a tool to manipulate or control. It was a perspective James had never considered, and it began to challenge the way he had always thought about money and success. With Ava's influence, James began to shift his focus from acquisition to impact. He started funding local charities, investing in projects that aimed to improve education and healthcare in underserved communities, and supporting entrepreneurs who were dedicated to sustainability and innovation. He didn't do it for the accolades or recognition, he did it because, for the first time in his life, he saw a real, tangible way his wealth could make a difference. As he became more involved in these causes, his sense of purpose deepened, and so did his feelings for Ava. She had unknowingly opened his eyes to the possibility of a life beyond ambition and control, a life that could be centered around compassion, contribution, and shared growth. The walls he had built around himself began to crumble. He started to realize that relationships built on mutual respect and shared values were far more fulfilling than those based on his position or wealth. He began to see Ava not just as a colleague, but as a partner, someone who challenged him to be better and who, in her quiet, thoughtful way, had changed the very way he looked at the world. Their relationship, once grounded in professionalism, slowly began to evolve into something deeper, something real, something profound. They began to spend more time together outside of work, talking about everything and nothing at all, finding common ground in their shared beliefs, and supporting each other through both the highs and lows of their respective journeys. James realized, as he looked at Ava, that he was no longer the man who used his wealth to define his worth. Instead, he had become someone who sought to live a life of meaning, a life where his resources were a force for good, and where true connection with others was the ultimate source of fulfillment. Ava had shown him that wealth wasn't something to be flaunted or used for control. It was a tool, a resource that could be used to make a lasting, positive impact on the world. And in that realization, James found not only a new sense of purpose but a new way of loving deeply, authentically, and without the need for validation from his possessions or status. As their relationship grew, James knew that this new perspective on life, and on love, was a gift he would treasure forever. What he had once viewed as a tool for dominance, he now saw as a way to build something far greater, a legacy of compassion, generosity, and genuine connection. James had always been the type of person who lived his life in the shadow of his wealth. Success had come easily to him, and with it, a certain arrogance he wasn't entirely aware of until Ava came into his life. He'd been used to people wanting things from him, to people flattering him because of his status and his ability to offer them something of value. But Ava was different. From the moment they met, she had shown him no interest in his money, his position, or his fame. In fact, she didn't even seem to notice the things that had once defined him. Instead, Ava saw him for who he really was, an individual behind the facade of wealth, someone who had spent his life building walls around himself, hiding behind his success to shield himself from the vulnerabilities that made him human. Ava's indifference to his wealth was both a challenge and a revelation for James. For the first time in years, he found himself drawn to someone who didn't need him for his resources or his reputation, someone who made him feel like he was more than just the sum of his accomplishments. But what truly began to change him wasn't just his affection for her, it was the way she made him see the world and himself in a completely different light. Ava had a quiet strength, a grace that didn't come from what she had, but from what she gave. She lived her life with kindness, without expecting anything in return, and it was that selflessness that began to chip away at the walls James had built around his heart. He found himself doing small things for others, things that had never even occurred to him before. He gave more generously, not because it would improve his image or make him look good, but because he truly wanted to help. It was as if Ava's ability to live with such sincerity and compassion had awakened something inside him, something he had long buried under years of privilege and pride. James began to understand the power of giving, not just material things, but time, attention, and care. He started volunteering at local charities, participating in community events, and offering his help without the expectation of anything in return. At first, it felt awkward, as if he were trying on a new suit that didn't quite fit. He didn't know how to interact with people who didn't share his lifestyle, who didn't look up to him because of his wealth, but as the days went by, something shifted within him. He felt lighter, more fulfilled in ways he couldn't explain. And through it all, Ava's presence in his life continued to ground him. She didn't ask him to change, she never told him he needed to be a better person. She simply lived her life in such a way that it made him want to be better, made him want to step outside of his comfort zone and truly connect with the world in a meaningful way. It was as though her quiet example had sparked a fire in him, a desire to live authentically and without the constraints of his wealth and status. As his affection for Ava deepened, it became clear that it wasn't just her disregard for his money that had captured his heart, it was the way she made him feel like he could be more than the person he had been. She didn't need anything from him, and that was liberating. In a world where people constantly took from him, Ava's ability to simply be, to live with integrity, to give freely, and to love unconditionally was something that made him want to be a better person, not just for her, but for himself. The more he spent time with her, the more he saw his own reflection in her eyes, but it was a reflection he hadn't recognized before. It wasn't the image of a wealthy businessman, standing tall and untouchable, it was the image of someone who was vulnerable, who had the power to love and to grow beyond his past mistakes. Ava's influence wasn't dramatic or forceful, it was quiet, subtle, and deeply transformative. She had no agenda, no expectation that he would change, but in her presence, he couldn't help but evolve. There were moments when they would sit together, talking about their lives, their dreams, and their fears, and James would realize how much he had shifted in a short period of time. He wasn't the man he had been when they first met, consumed by pride and the belief that his wealth was the most important thing about him. Now, he was learning the value of relationships, of selflessness, of being present in the lives of others. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, watching the sun dip below the horizon, James looked at Ava with a depth of emotion he hadn't expected. He realized that it wasn't just love that he felt for her, it was gratitude. She had made him see the world differently, made him want to be a better man, not because of her indifference to his wealth, but because of her ability to challenge him to be authentic and kind. In her, he saw the life he had always wanted, a life where the superficiality of wealth didn't define him, where true value was found in the way he treated others, in the way he showed up for the people who mattered. And as he watched Ava smile at him, her eyes filled with quiet understanding, James knew that his love for her was more than just a fleeting affection. It was a reflection of the person he was becoming, the person she had helped him find, the person who cared not for wealth, but for the richness of a life lived with purpose, compassion, and the willingness to grow. James had spent most of his life measuring his worth by the size of his bank account, the luxury of his possessions, and the status he had carefully crafted for himself. To him, love had always seemed transactional, a way to earn affection through the display of wealth and power. He had always believed that money could buy him anything, including the love and admiration of the people around him. But when he met Ava, everything he thought he knew about connection and relationships began to unravel. Ava wasn't impressed by his wealth. She saw through the glossy exterior he had so carefully built, and she didn't want his riches or his extravagant lifestyle, she wanted him. She wanted the real James, the man behind the suit and the car, the man who had buried his emotions behind layers of success and material possessions. At first, James didn't understand. He was accustomed to people wanting something from him, whether it was money, status, or influence. But Ava was different. She didn't need anything from him, except honesty. She was drawn to his vulnerability, to the small glimpses of the person he had hidden for so long, the man who had once dreamed of simpler things, who had known loss and pain, but who had buried those feelings deep in order to protect himself. Ava's presence in his life began to change him. Slowly but surely, she chipped away at the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart. Through quiet conversations and small gestures of kindness, she encouraged him to let go of the persona he had worn for years. It wasn't easy for James. He had spent so long defining himself by his wealth that it felt impossible to let go of that crutch. He feared that without it, he wouldn't be worthy of anyone's love, especially Ava's. Yet, as he spent more time with her, he began to see a different kind of love unfolding between them, one that wasn't based on transactions or expectations, but on understanding, trust, and mutual respect. Ava never asked him to change, never demanded anything from him except his honesty. And slowly, he started to believe that she loved him for who he truly was, not for what he could offer her. As their relationship deepened, James began to open up in ways he never thought possible. He shared stories from his past, stories of heartbreak, loss, and childhood dreams that had been crushed by the demands of ambition. He told her about the fear that had driven him to build his wealth, the fear that if he wasn't successful, he would be invisible, unworthy of love and respect. And Ava listened, truly listened, offering him the kind of validation he had never known before. In turn, James began to understand that Ava didn't need his money to validate her own worth, and neither did he. It was the connection they shared, the genuine, raw, unfiltered connection that was worth more than any material possession could offer. It wasn't until he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to step away from the facade of wealth and success, that he truly began to see Ava in all her beauty, not just as someone he wanted to impress, but as someone who had been offering him love from the start, in its most authentic form. Their relationship reached a turning point when James stopped trying to win Ava's love with grand gestures and expensive gifts. Instead, he started showing her the real parts of himself, the parts he had kept hidden from everyone, including himself. He learned that love wasn't about giving something to receive something in return, it was about being present, being sincere, and being willing to open up and share the deepest parts of yourself with another person. Ava, too, began to grow in ways she hadn't anticipated. In James, she discovered a man who was capable of deep emotional connection, who was willing to change for the right reasons, and who was willing to be vulnerable in ways she never thought possible. She had come to him with her own fears and insecurities, but through his willingness to shed the armor of his wealth, she felt safe enough to let down her own guard. Together, they began to build something real. It was messy, imperfect, and at times uncertain, but it was theirs. James no longer measured his worth by the numbers in his bank account. Instead, he measured it by his ability to be present for Ava, to listen to her, to understand her in ways that went beyond surface-level attraction or material gain. He understood now that true worth comes not from what you can offer materially, but from what you can give emotionally, spiritually, and vulnerably. Ava, too, let go of the idea that love was about finding perfection. She had been searching for someone who could meet her expectations, but in James, she found something better, a person who was willing to grow, to change, and to be open in a way that made her feel seen and valued. In the end, James and Ava's relationship became a testament to the transformative power of love and vulnerability. It wasn't about who had the most money or who could offer the grandest gesture. It was about two people coming together, letting go of their fears and insecurities, and embracing the beautiful messiness of what it means to love and be loved. James no longer sought Ava's affection through the things he could buy her or the status he could offer. He sought her love through his sincerity, his willingness to be real, and his dedication to building something together, without the crutch of his wealth. And in that, they found the most beautiful kind of connection, one that wasn't built on anything external, but on the internal truths that lay between them. Together, they embarked on a new beginning, one where love was not a transaction, but a shared experience of growth, understanding, and profound connection.